Hi, I'm Dineley from the University of Augsburg in Bavaria, and I'm very happy to talk to you here about the work of my colleagues and I that was part of the RADAR-CNS project, a very large multimodal longitudinal mHealth study where we've been collecting data in 6 countries in participants with one of 3 conditions, including major depression. And in our depression arm alone, we have over 600 participants. Luckily for us, speech is one of the data streams that we've been collecting. And we've been collecting it using 2 tasks, one scripted and one free speech. And the tasks are scheduled for our participants every 2 weeks for approximately 2 years. And they're scheduled immediately following 3 other questionnaires in the depression arm of the study for depression, self-esteem, and COVID once the pandemic started. And the particular aspect of our speech work that I'd like to tell you about is an investigation of how acceptable participants find recording their speech on their smartphones and the barriers that can prevent them from doing so. But why should we care about these issues in speech research anyway? Well, there's 2 ways this kind of knowledge is useful. If we understand the motivations and barriers that participants may encounter before we even find participants to provide their speech, we can design speech collection protocols to maximize the amount and quality of data we collect. And this is critical if we want advanced analytical techniques such as machine learning to perform well and live up to their potential. And it's particularly important in health research where the interpretations we make can have big implications. So as much as is feasible, we want to collect the best quality speech data, and we also need large speech data sets. As the saying goes, there's no data like more data. And this applies to one-off recordings and longitudinal speech collection, as you might do in mHealth to monitor someone's health state over time. We want to minimize gaps in the data as much as is within our control. The other way in which an understanding of participant acceptance can be valuable is interpreting and analyzing the speech data you've collected. The ideal being where you have specific knowledge of your particular cohort and study, because different factors will influence different kinds of participants, and every speech collection interface and task is different from the next. And it's particularly relevant when speech is being recorded in the wild, and we can't expect uniformly high quality recordings that have been made in an ideal acoustic environment as has been in the research previously. So there's several factors that can influence remote speech collection, and just to give some examples, the technical literacy of the participant in using a smartphone app, data privacy concerns that they may have, and also how much other mHealth data they may be providing. And it's important to note at this point that speech collection is a bit different from a lot of the data streams collected in mHealth. If you think of a depression questionnaire with multi-choice questions, or a fitness tracker that reports the number of steps each day, when we ask someone to record their voice, particularly if it's a free speaking task, this is something that's a bit more personal, particularly if participants have to talk about their feelings, or activities and people in their lives. So it's important that as researchers that we investigate the acceptance of speech and not just that of mHealth in general. And there's 2 main ways we can do that. We can look at objective measures, such as in a research study, how many recordings participants contributed, and we can also look for participant feedback. So in an interview or a survey, what was their experience in providing speech? Briefly, to look at related work out there, there's very few studies that are explicitly about speech in mHealth. The most recent example, actually reported just in August, this wasn't a speech collection or analytical study, but the researchers asked nearly 700 respondents who had self-reported their mental health disorders how they felt about recording their speech. And here responses were generally positive, but privacy was a concern. Now, in the RADAR-CNS speech survey, we were doing something a little bit different. We were asking participants who had experience of providing their speech and specific speech tasks, how they got on and how they found it. So we designed a quick and easy online questionnaire to ask them about this, to minimize the burden to them and hopefully maximize responses. And we invited 384 participants with major depression in Spain and the UK to do the survey. We received 209 responses. And in our analysis that I'm going to tell you about here, we focused on the 3 core issues. But before we did that, we examined the subset of participants who responded to our survey to understand how generalizable our survey results are to the wider RADAR study cohort in terms of socio-demographic characteristics and how much speech they contributed. So we did find there were significant differences in age. Our response cohort was slightly older, and our responders had completed somewhat more of their scripted speech tasks, so suggesting that the people who responded to our survey were a little bit more engaged in the study, which is perhaps not that surprising, but good to confirm and be aware of in interpreting the data. So moving on to the first of these 3 core issues we investigated, we asked participants, how comfortable are you recording your speech, asking them about each task separately. And if you look overall at responses, participants generally reported feeling comfortable completing the scripted speech task compared to the free speech task. And this is quite plausible, as you would expect that people reading aloud a set text that has no personal relevance would be a more comfortable experience than talking about things that you might be doing and thoughts and feelings. When we look closer, depression severity was the biggest predictor of how comfortable participants felt recording their speech. But the country of the speaker was also a predictor, so let's look at these more closely. Here, IDS score on the y-axis is a measure of depression severity. It's a clinical questionnaire. And we can see that the participants who were more depressed tended to be less comfortable recording their speech. And we know that fatigue and cognitive impairments increase with depression severity. So it's also plausible that if you're feeling fatigued and thinking is difficult, everything's a big effort, that recording your speech would also feel more uncomfortable and difficult. When we compare countries, we can see right away participants in Spain were less comfortable than those in the UK, here for the scripted speech task. And it's worth noting participants in Spain did have higher depression scores overall, but the participants' country remained a predictor after we controlled for depression severity. And we can see something similar in the free speech responses, although it's less dramatic. And we suspect differences in cultural attitudes play a role here, but it's something that we need to look into further. In a second core area, we were interested in barriers that prevented participants from contributing their speech on at least one occasion. And the take-home finding here is that 50% of respondents perceived no such barrier. When we look at this very long bar chart more closely, it's interesting to see what issues participants did not identify as barriers. So no one reported finding the instructions unclear, and only 1% of participants found the speech part of the study app difficult to use. So this was a positive thing, as we took some time to make the speech task as easy as possible to do. Very interestingly, only 7 of 206 respondents named privacy as concern. Now, this may well be a function of the cohort, as these are people who enrolled on an mHealth study, and so you'd expect they wouldn't have serious privacy concerns about providing their data. Looking at the most commonly reported barriers, the top one was participants not seeing app notifications. Now, we can't say for sure why they didn't see notifications, whether we can attribute this somehow to participant error or technical problems or app design or whatever, but it's still valuable to know that was an issue. The next most commonly reported barrier was low mood. And we knew anecdotally this was an issue for some participants in the depression arm of the study. So it wasn't a big surprise to see this response was relatively common. Participants forgetting to do the speech task was also not such a surprise. Forgetfulness is more common in individuals with major depression. And these are all aspects we're looking at in more detail in ongoing work. Moving on to the third core area, we investigated in the paper how closely participants' self-reporting of how often they recorded their speech resembled their actual activity in the study. And their reporting was quite different from the reality. Overwhelmingly, they overestimated their activity. And so this is pretty striking. And there could be several factors at work here. It's possible participants unknowingly missed app notifications for the speech task, so they didn't realize they hadn't completed it. And we do have some anecdotal evidence from our clinical co-authors. They noticed participants did get notifications for different study tasks mixed up. They didn't necessarily distinguish between the different notifications. And as I mentioned at the start of this talk, participants were scheduled to do 4 questionnaires at the same time. So it's possible this kind of queue of tasks to do at the same time contributed in this scenario. We'd also expect recall bias and social desirability to play some part here. There's plenty of examples in the broader scientific literature, how in general humans aren't always so accurate at recalling what they've been doing or how often they did something. And participants could also have intentionally over-reported their participation out of shame or just wanting to appear to be a good participant. And depression-related cognitive effects could also play a role here in all of this. In any case, it's also something that we're looking into further. So that's all I have to say here. But if you can make it, do come and see us in our session at Interspeech or the additional session. And if you're interested in our work but can't make it due to the time zone, do reach out to us on the discussion on the conference platform or on Twitter or by email. I'd just like to thank my co-authors, the RADAR-CNS Patient Advisory Board, and the participants themselves for all their amazing contributions. Also, thanks to all the partner organizations on RADAR-CNS. And thank you very much for your time. I hope you have a great Interspeech.